Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting schillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast welcomes Tim Muehlhoff, professor of communications at Biola University, co-author along with Sean McDowell of the new book and the Stalemate, Move Past Cancel Culture to Meaningful Conversations. And Tim Muehlhoff, thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I want to start here because a lot of people probably don't give a lot of thought to the importance of differences of opinion. Why is that an important thing for us to realize?
I would say differences of opinion sharpens us. I was on the debate team in college, and they would have us write a speech that represented our perspective. But then the next assignment was you had to write another speech that totally went against the first speech, but then you presented both of them to a coach, but she didn't know which one was your actual topic. So they heard both sides of an issue, and their job was, can you present both sides with equal passion and objectivity? I've never forgotten that assignment on the debate team, and it sharpened me to listen to articulate viewpoints that really challenge my own perspective. I think today, because of tribalism, where we're kind of, stuck in our own little community, we're not hearing articulate counter perspectives to what me or my friends believe.
I think even in interpersonal relationship, for example, in a marriage, a lot of people think life would just be so much easier if we just agreed on everything. I'd imagine you disagree with that.
Well, let me say this, because I do teach a marriage class at Biola.
Yeah.
There is something called core compatibility, where on the big issues like finances, purpose of the marriage, fundamentally, how do we raise the kids? We know that successful marriage, really, you have to be in the center of core compatibility with each other. But how you do those things is a matter of opinion, and that's what makes a marriage interesting is we want our kids to flourish. We want to save money, but we have different opinions of how to do that. So that's why it's good to listen to a person and their perspective and learn from it. Doesn't mean you have to agree with it. And that's what concerns me the most. We're just not opening ourselves up to very many counter perspectives. And I think there's really value in doing that, welcoming it, even seeking it out.
A lot of people get very personally rattled when people don't agree with them, and they're just not able to do that. So what do you say to the person who says, well, it rattles me too much if I have to talk to a person with this opinion, or if I'm in a family relationship with a person of this opinion, I'd rather just cut them off than have these difficult conversations?
Well, I would say we're kind of a byproduct of our culture. And today we live in what Georgetown linguist Deborah Tannen calls the argument culture. She coined that almost 20 years ago, that phrase. So I think a lot of us have grown up without developing that muscle of how do we slowly begin to become more comfortable listening to counter perspectives. That's why with the book and the Stalemate, we created an interactive website that's totally free. Your listeners can go to it. It's just endthestalemate.com, where they're going to prepare their hearts to listen to a counter perspective, one that's going to go against most likely what they believe. The topic we chose is politics because of the November election and the debate a bunch of us just recently saw. And you're going to listen to a really articulate Christian say you can't read your Bible and vote for President Trump. Then you're going to listen to an equally articulate Christian who says, okay, is he rough around the edges? Yes. But when you look at his platform, I think that's what Jesus would advocate. You're going to hear two really articulate people, and that's a way of, and we'll teach you how to listen to both and find common ground with both. But we need to practice doing that, and this website's designed, you can do that in the privacy of your own home. not in an actual conversation, but you can just work on being introduced to perspectives that might push your own perspective.
So if you were to look across America today, how would you classify or qualify the present state of American discourse?
Well, I go back to what Deborah Tannen says, the argument culture, that we view disagreements like a verbal slugfest. I do a podcast myself called the Winsome Conviction Podcast. We had on Arthur Brooks, a Harvard researcher, and he said this. It was like a drop the mic moment. He said, America doesn't have an anger problem. We have a contempt problem. And the difference, we asked him, so he said, the difference is I can be angry at you, but still want to stay in the marriage. You're still part of the family. We're still neighbors. We're still coworkers. Contempt is, listen, I'm mad at you, and this church would be better off without you. This neighborhood would be better off without you, and this family would even be better off without you. I think we're in an age of contempt today, where a lot of people are saying we just would be better off with the entire opposite political party, and I think we got to be very careful of falling into the contempt trap.
So why is it that we have trouble seeing the good or the value in people when just there's a face value disagreement?
I'm going to point to leadership. I'm going to say what I watched last night, but the first presidential debate was on, and watching it was really hard to watch. I mean, you talk about contempt. Mm-hmm. Oh, my goodness. Last night was a full-blown presentation of two people who absolutely have contempt for each other. And I'm a college professor. So there's something called the vanishing voter. This is people 24 and under. They're done. They are done with politics, and they're done with what they just witnessed last night. So I think we need to be concerned with not just what we're saying, but how we're saying it. See, as a communication professor, we know communication exists on two levels, not just one level. One level is content. That's our arguments, statistics, reasons we believe what we believe. But equally important is the relational level, and that's the amount of compassion, respect, and acknowledgement between two individuals. And we know if you violate the relational perspective, people do not care about your content. So I would say watch that debate and judge the relational level between their communication and what they just modeled for the entire nation. And that's why I think we're in a communication crisis today in America.
You have an interesting section in the book talking about storms that we face as a nation and as a people. And the first one is realizing that we have a lot of hurting people. How do you mean that? What are they hurting from, and how is that affecting things?
Well, that hurt is, depression and a sense of loneliness. This has been building up for years and years and years, and COVID kind of poured gasoline on it. So I think you have a lot of people today who feel life is overwhelming. They feel alone in their struggles. They don't feel a sense of community. That loss of a sense of community has been building up equally for years and years and years. So you get a lot of people who feel isolated and we're doing life alone. And this is a little bit of tribalism, is I just go to people who think like I do. If I go to anybody, I go to people who would agree with my perspective. And I think we're losing the sense of community today, of being neighbors with each other. And I think that's weakened us as a nation. Sociologists talk about social capital. Social capital is the resources we have as a neighborhood, resources we might have as a state, a nation, that we all can pull from. And I think today we don't think we have much social capital because we're all fractured today. So I think that's added to the sense of isolation that many Americans feel today.
So kind of tagging on to that, Tim, there's the whole problem of clashing worldviews. And I think it used to be portrayed that we kind of had an underlying unity in America. And now the worldviews are very divergent to extreme conditions. For example, abortion. If someone feels there's no problem with that at all, and someone else feels you're essentially eliminating the greatest gift that God gives to humanity, how do you reconcile that in a clashing worldview?
So that's why the book is called End the Stalemate, because honestly, the book wasn't written to end the stalemate on Capitol Hill, because that's way above my pay grade. That's way above Sean's pay grade. But if we're talking about ending the stalemate with a neighbor, or a coworker, and you do see abortion differently, and very strongly you see it differently, there's still things you can do to have points of contact, points of commonality with a person, even though you disagree about immigration, you disagree about race, you disagree about abortion. And that's what the book is really about, is how do you foster these points of connection with a person that you really disagree with. And that's reestablishing the relational level before you actually get to the content level. And I would say that's a big takeaway from the book, is there are things you can do with your neighbor, family member that you really disagree with to remind them of your commonality as you move towards points of disagreement.
I'd love for you to comment on social media and how this fits into the picture, again, as one of the storms.
I'm not prepared to lay everything at the feet of social media. And by the way, it's not going anywhere. Yeah. And so we better figure out how to use it in more productive ways. But I think social media today does two things. One scholar said it makes me perpetually irritated. I read my news feed and I just shake my head at what the other side thinks. If you look at the debate, you just go around and, different outlets, USA Today, CNN, Fox, you get some really interesting comments about what just happened in the election. And I tend to shake my head at the view that I disagree with. Second, it feeds into tribalism. My news feed, because of algorithms, literally starts to give me the news I want. Not the news I prefer, but it picks up on my tendencies of where I'm going, and it starts to feed me things it thinks I want to hear. That's part of the tribalism. So I agree with Secretary Hillary Clinton, who said the new public square today is the internet. And I would agree with that. We need to find out a way to productively have conversations. So we dedicate parts of the book to how you might think about using social media to foster connection, not division.
You use the term cancel culture in the title of the book, and I want to go to two things surrounding the cancel culture, and then I want you to help us understand this a little bit better. Number one is what I see people call the heckler's veto, where people are coming here, for example, to the University of Virginia, where we broadcast from in Charlottesville. People show up and try to shout down so that the person can't be heard. And secondarily, I've seen claims at public meetings that people holding opposite opinions, that their speech is violence, and their speech, while not inciting violence, that the speech itself is violence and should be eliminated, and the right to speak should be curtailed.
Well, we just went to Berkeley. I'm part of the Winsome Conviction Project at Biola University in La Mirada, California. We went to Berkeley. Now think about this. Berkeley is the home of the free speech movement. We actually took a selfie standing in the very spot that the free speech movement actually originated. Well, here's what Berkeley says. We can't have conservative speakers on campus, not because we don't value what they believe. We can't ensure their safety. Thus, we can't invite conservative speakers on campus. That's the cancel culture. Cancel culture to me is I'm shutting down the conversation before it even begins. Like, we're not going to have this conversation. If that means me shouting over you, that means me demonizing you to such an extent that you get shut down on the internet. And let me just make this point that is not a popular point. Since I've been doing these interviews, everybody shakes their head, yes, that's what the left does. The left is canceling the right. But having been part of the Winsome Conviction Project, I got to tell you, Christians have their own version of cancel culture. And it is pretty robust within the church. Let me give you two examples. Yeah. I have a friend of mine who just wrote a book on critical race theory and gave a nuanced perspective. Nuance, which means he talked about the negatives and the positives. He was released from a Christian organization he belonged to because he wrote a nuanced book on critical race theory. That's our form of canceling.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment. Our guest is Tim Muehlhoff, and the book is End the Stalemate.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
ShillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
ShillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit ShillingShowMedia.com.
ShillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit SchillingShowMedia.com. That's SchillingShowMedia.com.
Get your fix. Schilling Show Unleashed.
We continue now with Tim Muehlhoff, co-author of End the Stalemate, Move Past Cancel Culture to Meaningful Conversations. I'd love to talk more about how COVID-19 shutdowns exacerbated this divide because, my goodness, the issues that circled around that issue are still with us today.
Historians have already begun to notice a very interesting trend that happened in history. 9/11, and it may have been short, it brought the nation together.
Yes.
We literally set aside our ideologies or political views because America had been violently attacked. COVID, exact opposite. It was politicized from the get-go, and it actually drove a wedge between Americans. So you would have hoped COVID would have been a time where we say, listen, let's set aside our differences because, we're facing a pandemic, and a lot of us are frightened. We're suffering physically, emotionally, spiritually, but it had the exact opposite effect. It became weaponized very quickly. So Winsome Conviction Project was during COVID. This is when we were really gaining momentum, and churches split over mask mandates. Our university, Biola, which stands for the Bible Institute of Los Angeles, we were split among faculty about mask mandates, about whether you should take the vaccine, whether we should listen to LA County that was very restrictive in saying what we could do as a private Christian university. So it really put pressure on churches and put pressure on Christian universities like ours.
Why do you think there was a different response to 9/11 and then some 20 years later to COVID?
Because I think it was 20 years later. I think this is affecting us deeply in ways. Now we have kids, again, I'm a college professor, they've been brought into the argument culture. They don't have the muscles or the inclination to want to reach out to people that are different from them. It's not part of the DNA of our country anymore. And I would argue to a certain extent, it's not the DNA of our churches to reach out to people who think differently. I have a pastor friend of mine who decided to do a series on world religions and brought an imam, brought a Jewish rabbi, and put him up on stage to have a conversation. He estimates he lost 20% of his congregation because he brought in a Muslim and a rabbi into the church and put him up on the altar, right on the main stage. He lost 20% of his congregation. Many of them just left without even telling him. That's kind of the contempt part that Arthur Brooks was trying to get at. I'm done with you and I'm leaving. So I think it's worse because the more we reside in this, and I don't think it's getting better based on that presidential election. Now, hopefully the national uproar is going to be so great. And this is where I have a little bit of hope. The uproar is going to be so great that maybe both candidates pull back and say, okay, this is not good. I don't know. Maybe that'll happen if the uproar is strong enough. And I think the church needs to lead that uproar to say, well, no, we believe in speaking truth and love. And there wasn't a whole lot of love on that stage.
When in the book you talk about healthy relationships and building them, let's start with the definition of a healthy relationship. What does that look like?
That's coming from communication theory, which is often rooted in psychology. So I would say personally, we talk about healthy communication climates, which is made up of expectations, commitment, acknowledgement, and trust. So I would say a healthy communication climate is where you're firing on all cylinders in all four of those areas. We trust each other. We're committed to this relationship. I acknowledge what you say, even though I don't agree with it. I acknowledge the weight of it. And then we have certain expectations of what this relationship will look like. And I'm glad you brought that up because I don't want people to think this book is about politics. Mm-hmm. It's really not. I think it works well with politics, but it's really about ending the stalemate with a neighbor, coworker, family member, somebody in your church small group. That's where I think these principles really can be effective.
Another of the techniques that you use in the book is kind of sharing your worldview, but also understanding and demonstrating an understanding of others' worldview. How do you get there?
It's a great chapter on how to surface a person's perspective. There's a great proverb that says a person's thoughts are like deep waters, and the goal of a conversationalist is to surface those deep waters. We believe things for a multitude of reasons. We're not just walking computers that we only believe in things for cognitive, intellectual reasons. We believe things for a multitude of reasons. So to find out the family that that person grew up in, what were the values of the family? What were the values of your community? Who are the people you listen to? Like if there was a Mount Rushmore of people whose perspectives you really listen to, that could be a podcast, it could be a book, it could be a movie, a TED Talk. And then there's something called narrative injury, which means things happen in our lives, pain, that really changes how we approach life. We mentioned C.S. Lewis in that on narrative injury. When he lost his wife, Joy, and this is one of the greatest defenders of Christianity who's ever lived, he never publicly shared his faith again after the death of his wife, because he believed his wife had been cured by a miracle of cancer, and then she came out of remission and died very quickly. He was devastated. So to try to find those narrative injury moments in a person's life, and by the way, as you're surfacing and asking these questions, you're affirming the relationship. This is the acknowledgement part of a communication climate. I'm not debating your life experiences. I'm trying to understand them and surface them and have a great conversation about why do you believe the things that you believe.
Taking the perspective of others is something that is so important. This is modeled in the Bible and also in everyday life. So maybe a couple of examples or an example out of the Bible, like where is that shown? And then in everyday life, what would that look like?
This is, if I said I have a specialty, I would say this is what I did in grad school, developed a model for how to do perspective taking. But as a Christian, you see this throughout the scriptures so very quickly. The book of Ecclesiastes, the writer, most likely Solomon, asks you to do perspective taking. In one part of Ecclesiastes, he says, I want you to imagine life under the sun, which means there is no God. There's no heaven. There's no life after death. This is all we have is life on planet Earth. So I want you to imagine that. But then every once in a while, he bounces out of that. And he says, but listen, there's life above the sun, which is there's a God. There's justice. There's eternity that we need to think about. Jump to the New Testament. The writer of Hebrews says, I want you to pray for fellow Christ followers in prison. And we know those conditions were deplorable in the New Testament time. Such a beautiful phrase. I want you to imagine you were in prison. And I want you to imagine their pain as if it's affecting your own body. Well, that's what we call perspective taking. So when I listen to a person that I disagree with, I need to set aside my viewpoint long enough to step in to their perspective to see it through their eyes. So let me give you an example. I become friends with a set of Christian parents who have decided to let their child transition. Set aside what you believe about that just for a second and step into their shoes and understand what an agonizing decision this has been for these two parents. They cry themselves to sleep at night because they feel like their child is in agony, and they have come to the point where they decided the best way to relieve this agony is to allow their child to transition. Now, stop right there. I'm probably just like your listeners. I'm thinking of 50 million reasons I don't agree with that. Mm-hmm. Okay, but that's the content level. I'm talking about the relational level. So to listen to these parents and to understand and feel their pain is what we call perspective taking. Another word for that could be empathy, that I imagine I'm in your situation and a child cries himself, herself to sleep every night and believes God's made a mistake. Can we just feel that pain for a little bit until we get to the content, which is going to be the reasons we don't feel that that's a good decision, a healthy decision, or a biblical decision. So in today's argument culture, we start with the relational, and then we move to the content. So when Paul says speak truth in love, I think we start with the love today, and then we get to the truth.
Engaging others is one of the important things that you reference in the book, and we hear that word a lot, but what does it actually mean? And what is the importance of engaging somebody?
Well, I love that word engage. Now, listen, are Christians concerned about persuasion? Sure we are. Paul says to the church at Corinth, knowing the fear of the Lord, we seek to persuade men. But engagement is setting up a conversation. Like, how do you do that? The book of Proverbs says a word spoken in the right circumstance is compared to fine jewelry. So what our book is about is how do you set up the conditions to have an engaging conversation? I would say engaging means it's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. See, a monologue is, hey, let me sit you down, let me set you straight. Right? You're going to let your kid transition, let me give you 10 reasons why that's a really bad idea. That is the content level. We want to set up the conditions by which your concerns can actually be heard by the other person and considered. And then we're in a place where I invite their opinion. Like, this isn't just a one-way street. I'm inviting you to give me the reasons why you see it this way, why you interpret the Bible that way, why you think mask mandates are this and critical race theory is that, or finances or the kid's schedule or anything like that. We're trying to set the preconditions to have a robust conversation. That's why we developed the interactive website and the stalemate.com, because we got to practice this. And that's a great place to go in the privacy of your own home office, where you can have a bad day listening to a person's perspective and scream at the computer screen, I disagree with that. And you haven't hurt the relationship.
Some common mistakes you reference, and this one's very important, and people need to understand the distinction between reacting versus responding.
Well, welcome to the reaction world today. I mean, this is the negative part of social media, where, man, we whip off a response, we send a tweet, we don't even think about it. We are reaction machines, and boy, that causes problem. Anybody who's married, any one of your listeners who's married knows how reacting can cause problems. I didn't agree with that, so I just spoke my mind, and you didn't even finish your sentence, and I'm saying, I don't agree with that. I think you're wrong. I didn't say that. Responding is fully understanding what the other person is saying, then throw in perspective taking. I'm not just going to hear what you say. I'm going to try to feel what you say. So you feel like we're being irresponsible with our finances and we're actually putting our family in jeopardy when it comes to our savings. Okay, I might want to react against that and say, okay, we're doing fine. What are you looking at? What stuff are you looking at? I think we're doing fine. That's reacting. Responding would be, okay, tell me more about that. Tell me more about why you think we're in danger and how does that make you feel when you go to bed at night? Boy, that's a great place to hang out because we can get to our opinion of what they just said, but man, that should probably be down the road a little bit.
How do you know when it's time to walk away? I mean, not every situation is going to be resolved. Not every person is going to be receptive to the things we talked about today. So how do you determine that as an individual?
Well, if I had to summarize the whole book of Proverbs, which I use a lot in my writing, you do this in community. Wise counselors. So if you're getting ready to walk away from a job, walk away from a marriage, walk away from a community, a church, I would sit down with wise counselors and I would lay out why I think it's time to walk. And in the book, we do say there are reasons you would walk away from a church. But have wise counselors who aren't just yes persons, right, who agree with everything you say, but a person who can push back and say, but have you thought about this? Yes, maybe you should consider leaving, but is now really the time for that? Can't you evoke change within your church, marriage, or community? So that's why wise counselors is really the heartbeat of the book of Proverbs.
Tim Muehlhoff, if people want to get a copy of your book, End the Stalemate, or if they want to follow the things that you do online, tell us how, please.
Well, the book can be found virtually anywhere. So Amazon, Tyndale House, the good books. And then if you want to follow what we're doing, I'd go to winsomeconviction.com. That's our website. All of our podcasts are there, a lot of free resources. And then I would just throw out endthestalemate.com is that interactive website we created with a really talented web designer.
Tim Muehlhoff, you've done a fantastic job in presenting the importance of ending the stalemate and how to do it. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.